Thank you very much, sir. It's a pleasure to be in with you tonight. Well, before I leave this, and I will leave it right after this story, Forrest sent a little something to me. That's what I love about the Coast to Coast AM audience. You really are the coolest, most well-informed audience on this or any other planet. Here we go. And then I'll leave it. Casper, Wyoming. That's not exactly the largest metropolis in our country, is it? This is from November 30. A man wielding a sharp-edged weapon, hence the Neanderthal man music. I'm not sure they had edged weapons, but you get the drift. Well, this person killed one in a Casper neighborhood Friday before killing a male teacher and himself in front of students in a community college classroom, causing a campus-wide lockdown as authorities tried to piece together what happened. So you see, in this case, firearms had absolutely nothing to do with it. So would everybody please just get off of it? Because believe me, it's a lot easier to have your civilization overthrown if you're unarmed. And as the old bumper sticker says, politicians prefer unarmed peasants. Can't wait. Absolutely cannot wait and will not wait to get into our discussion tonight. What a lot of work. The Giza Death Star destroyed. Secrets of the Unified Field. It's the second book in the list I'm reading. Philadelphia Experiment, The Nazi Bell, and the Discarded Theory. Nazi International, the Nazis' post-war plan to control finance, conflict, physics, and space. Roswell and the Reich, the Nazi connection. Babylon's banksters, the alchemy of high finance, deep physics, and ancient religion. Genes, giants, monsters, and men. The surviving elites of the cosmic war and their hidden agenda. And tonight, transhumanism. A grimoire of alchemical agendas. We'll be back with Doctors Joseph P. Farrell and Scott D. DeHart in just a moment. This is the one, the only Coast to Coast AM. Without further ado, because there's been too much already, let us bring into the global living room along with you, Doctors Joseph P. Farrell and Scott D. DeHart. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you, John. Thank you for having us on.
You were last on with George Norrie back in April of 2011. That's a little bit too long. And what an amazing body of work you have here. It's just stunning what you've put out.
Well, thank you. It's been a long haul, and they're all kind of related to each other, so think of them as one big book.
Yeah, I was sort of getting the drift as I went through it. I don't know. There's so much we can get into, but tonight we'll talk about transhumanism. Mm-hmm. Tell us what that is. I've looked around the web just to try and find some sort of a coherent definition of it, but it still has the yawn factor if I do it, so you do it.
Well, it's an interesting question, John, and I'll give my take and then kind of let Scott give his. As far as I'm concerned, and when we were starting the research on this, we ran into an interesting thing, and that's why we structured the book the way we did. And that is transhumanism to us is the total transformation of mankind. In other words, what we're trying to do in the book is raise the question, what is it to be human, and what do we want to become? Transhumanism views humanity as something that's pliable, that's malleable, that they can engineer and remake in any fashion that they wish. And they do so by a variety of technological means that we get into in the book. So one of the definitions that we ran into is actually a definition that's given by Ray Kurzweil. And in his book, The Singularity is Near, he says that transhumanism really is the extension of human consciousness, of humanity, throughout the universe. And when he said that, that kind of got, at least for my part, got me thinking that, well, what they're really talking about then is alchemy. Because one of the things that alchemy talks about repeatedly in its lore is that in order to confect the philosopher's stone, the transmutation of base metals into gold,
yes,
it's first necessary for mankind to transmute himself. So they look to a transformation of mankind, the elevation of his consciousness, the gaining of immortality. And all of this in alchemy is through technological means. So that's kind of what led us to the idea that transhumanism, viewed in that light, is really talking about nothing more than alchemy in modern scientific and technological clothes.
And now alchemy, to the layman, is just taking one thing, like lead, and then converting it to a much more valuable substance, which would be gold. At least that's
right.
the commonly encountered story.
Right, and that's a profound clue into what the transhumanists think they're doing. They think literally that these technologies that, we're going to be talking about tonight in conjunction with this alchemical agenda, they truly think that what they're doing is transforming base humanity into something new, something different, something improved, humanity upgrade version 2. And they're doing this by a variety of means, that all, when you start to look at the comparison between transhumanism and alchemy, each of the 4 stages of alchemy and the descent of man in esoteric lore and in alchemy is in evidence in transhumanism. So they're basically trying to reverse engineer the whole alchemical process.
Well, looking at grimoire, at first you think, what does this mean, a grim story? It's actually a textbook of sorcery and magic, yes?
Yes, a
magician's manual for invoking demons and the spirits of the dead.
Yes, exactly. And that's exactly what we try to convey with the use of that word. What transhumanism is, they have what they call the GRIN technologies: genetic, robotic, informational processing, and nanotechnology. And these are the 4 main technologies that they are looking at, the transhumanists are looking at, to transform mankind by a technological means. Well, when you get right down to it, then, what they're talking about is a recipe book. They've got a grimoire, basically, of what we call alchemical agendas, and that basically is where we're coming from in this book.
And to borrow, also to jump in there, Joseph, the quotation of Arthur Clarke, any sufficiently advanced technological advance is indistinguishable from magic.
Right.
It is one.
Well, that's true.
We chose that intentionally.
Well, yes, and the magician knows how the trick is done, so we sit in amazement in the audience, and the magician just goes through the motions.
Right. One of the things that we need to start out with, John, is the idea in alchemy that you have 4 stages of mankind, of the origin of mankind. And when you first hear these things, they sound so totally removed from anything modern. They begin with mankind in his highest state, which is an androgyny, in other words, a fusion of male and female. And then as mankind differentiates more and more, he falls, so to speak, into a mineral condition. And then he falls further into a vegetable condition. And then finally, in the final stage of mankind, the 4th stage of mankind, you have animal man. So if you look at it in terms of modern cosmology, this is exactly the sequence of things that you see in modern cosmology. You begin in this state of nothingness, basically, and then you descend from there, the creation of the elements after the Big Bang, and then you've got the appearance of plant life, and then finally animal life. Well, what alchemy tries to do is to back engineer or reverse engineer that process so that mankind can ascend back up that ladder. And that's exactly what the transhumanists are doing, because when you look at what they're talking about all sorts of fusions of mankind and mineral, mankind and plants, mankind and animals. So in other words, you're dealing, once again, basically with an old esoteric agenda.
Unbelievable.
Yeah,
right.
It is. It truly is.
Well, let me just add. Let's just jump right into it, and then let's get into the what's generally called the fall of man.
Right.
Are the people who are perpetrating this transhumanistic initiative, are they in any way in touch with these ancient spirits? Do they exist? Are spirits and the unseen world of the spirits, is this a component of your, what is clearly scientific research?
Oh, boy. I think we'd have to answer yes. One of the things that we mention in the book toward the very end is the ascent back up to androgyny. And one of the things that, if you examine the ancient texts very clearly, they speak of this state of mankind. Even the Bible, if you look at Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, in the original Greek. If you read the Greek carefully enough, you'll discover that, again, it's referring to a primordial state of androgyny. Well, what the transhumanists appear to be doing is they are reverse engineering this whole process to get back to some primordial state. And when we were researching the book, Scott and I were just dumbfounded. We discovered that Oak Ridge National Laboratory is researching genetic makeup of homosexuality in conjunction with other behavioral genetic research that they're doing. So it's almost as if they are looking for something that would give them the clue or the insight into the primordial aspect of the human genome. So I would have to answer yes. I can't speak for my co-author on that, but that would be my answer.
Well, I would add in there that we find that there have been continual and even recent scientific experiments being conducted, even in the United States, where androgenes, mixed-sex human embryos, have been created under the guise of harvesting stem cells. However, the fact that the experiments are aiming at a particular form of a human or something that is human-like reaches not only into the question as to what is it specifically about that type of being, but you tie it back into the alchemistic agenda in the Middle Ages and tie it back further into the ancient ideas that are taught in cultures and in various religions, and it begins to seem like a seamless, threaded fabric that every culture, philosophy, religion, and those who would seek to control it are keen on recovering. And that was a very important issue for us.
This is very interesting. Now, I'm just a little confused, and in this way. Does transhumanism involve the spiritual and alteration of our physical and otherwise natural selves?
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
So this thing about the British, and there are 150 some odd different varieties of cross-pollinated creatures, shall we call them.
Yeah.
This is part and parcel to it.
Oh, yes. Yes, absolutely.
Well, if the ultimate goal is to reach a higher level of consciousness as an entire society that has a very ancient idea in a much earlier civilization before a supposed linguistic fall of mankind, a supposed sexual fall of mankind, a supposed cultural, philosophical fall of mankind, there is a unity in the earliest views of civilization. So to recover that, man has to be seen as part of the macrocosm, and in a sense, the macrocosm has to be part of himself. That is a very spiritual cosmic awareness that is in every way related to fusing the biological and the technological into an individual, or creating an individual that could be, in a sense, the medium connecting the linguistic as well as the sexual as well as the cultural philosophy that unites mankind. It is a very, not just in terms of a physical expression in transhumanism, it is a consciousness. And if you call that spiritual, it is very spiritual.
Yeah, let me add one thing to what Scott said, if I may, John.
Absolutely.
In the beginning of the book, we go through a bunch of ancient texts and view them from the standpoint of what we call the Tower of Babel moment, when mankind loses that primordial unity. So in other words, there's always a spiritual component to this. And one of the most interesting texts, we thought, was the ancient Mayan Popol Vuh. Because in that text, you have a clear statement that mankind was in this primordial state of unity. And because of that, mankind possessed unique, almost godlike knowledge, and as such, therefore constituted a threat to the gods. And so they came down and split up mankind and divided mankind. And you find that idea again even in the Old Testament with the Tower of Babel story there. Because, again, what do you have? You have a claim being made that if mankind completes this tower, and, of course, the idea of a tower is connotes or conjures up the image of ascent back up to something. Well, if mankind completes the tower in the Old Testament version of the story, the statement is made that he will be able to do whatsoever he imagines to do. So in other words, again, it's this idea of a lost knowledge and power, and therefore mankind has to be divided. So there's a definite spiritual component to this when the transhumanists are talking about engineering all of these chimerical creations, because again, what they're trying to do is climb that ladder of descent of mankind when he fell. They're trying to reverse that whole process and climb back up.
Do you find as you go through these texts that some of the, well, with the advent of some of the ones who came after the ancient texts, like this Ludwig Andreas von Feuerbach, is there a little bit of a contradiction here between the spiritual and the fact that so many of these people were professed atheists? How is it possible to have one without the other?
Oh boy, that goes, we think, to the heart of what we call an ancient topological metaphor of the physical medium. And what we mean by that is if you look at a lot of these different ancient texts, they're basically giving you more or less the same cosmology. Everything begins from a state of absolute nothingness, and this is a real difficult thing for the modern mind to wrap itself around. But if you go back and you read early Christian mystics, or if you read early philosophers, the Neoplatonists and so on, or even for that matter the Vedic literature from India, they'll all come down and say that God is nothing. In other words, that there's no known predicate in the human mind or experience that can be univocally applied to God. And therefore that God is quite literally nothing. All right? So, that kind of gives rise to the old joke, what's the difference between an atheist and a mystic? Well, the only difference is a mystic capitalizes the word nothing. So this metaphor...
That's a good one.
Yeah, this metaphor can be taken and has been interpreted in both a theistic and an atheistic sense, and done so legitimately in both cases. So if there is a presence, as there is in so many transhumanists, of an atheistic impulse, really it's because they're looking at this metaphor, we think, in terms of just one of its paradigms. But there's that other paradigm of a theistic interpretation. But the end result, and this is what really kind of grabbed us when we started doing the research, John, the end result of this is the same. Because in either case, what they're really talking about is, once again, this total transformation of mankind, especially human society and culture and consciousness.
I think I would jump in also to add that even among those who might be considered some of the foremost medieval theologians, they were also in some cases men of science, and some of what they were attempting to do would border on the line of what I think today many people would say was heresy, and yet they were also the advocates and the writers of some of the most important theology at the time, and they are still read today as great theologians of the church, which raises the question, where is that line between science and faith, and what is permissible and what is not permissible? And there were quite a few of them that pushed the boundaries of that line right up to the very edge of what I would say was lingering on recreating some form of early mankind without the means of either women or God.
Right.
Well, we're going to come up on a hard break here, so if we don't get to finish, if I have to jump in there and chop us off, I definitely want to. I definitely want to find out. Well, I don't know. My brain's going in about 6 different directions right here at the moment, so I'm going to. Yeah, it really is. I wonder how it is possible that these great thinkers came to some sort of an understanding of the nature of consciousness. According to Neville Goddard, there can be no reality without consciousness. So how did they account for that? Let's take our break and get into it when we come back with our guest tonight. Doctors Joseph P. Farrell and Dr. Scott D. DeHart. Yes, the doctors are in. And this is Coast to Coast AM. You know, let us remember, well, we're well into the 9th now, but this is still the night of the 8th. Isn't it just amazing? When was John Lennon murdered? December 8th, 32 years ago. I remember I worked for a rock station called The Zoo, KZEW, and I was so stunned when the news came over the national airwaves that John Lennon had been shot dead in New York City. I had never done this before. I was sitting next door at a friend's house, and I just felt compelled to grab I don't know. It's no wonder you mix it with Coca-Cola most of the time. It's a kiddie drink, but I took a swig of Jack Daniels, and it did not help. The next morning, I wrote in soap across the back of this black Trans Am I had in those days, Lennon was murdered, miss him. And when I got to the station, I was shocked to see. I also ripped off a piece of a black T-shirt and I tied it around my arm. I didn't know what else to do. He'd just been so much a part. He and the Beatles had been so much a part of my youth, and they never sang about anything except love and brotherhood and things like this. So I'm not convinced that the instant karma he was talking about, I'm not sure that karma had anything to do with it at all, except a case can be made for it. Can it? Because for someone who sang and preached about really nothing but love, to meet an end like that seemed ever so incongruous. You know, it's common knowledge that there are consequences for one's actions, sometimes punishment, and sometimes punishment comes even for those who did nothing. So are there people out there actually trying to make the argument that since punishment is levied upon the innocent, that every guilty person should not be punished, to put balance into the system, to balance the karma, especially if it's good for business? We really should remember what, in my opinion, was the real greatest rock and roll band in the world. And I'm not even sure that it was rock and roll. It was something entirely different. But I hope you'll indulge me just a few moments to recognize the passing of John Lennon. A tragedy for all of us, whether we liked his music or not. We'll be back with our guests in just a moment. This is Coast to Coast AM. John B. Wells in with you for the ride tonight with our guest tonight, Doctors Joseph P. Farrell and Scott D. DeHart. Say, just to wrap it up on that John Lennon thing, when I got to the station, everybody looked at me like I was crazy. It's like, what? What are you making such a big deal out of it? And, of course, a couple of days later came the unprecedented 1 minute of silence. Weenies. Anyway, back to our guest tonight. Gentlemen, please carry on with where we were, which is, how do you define reality? These people who are trying to affect this transhumanistic initiative, they must have given some consideration to the actual nature of human reality, our perception of a world and a universe. So how is this, can you shed any light on what is their definition of reality? Is it a malleable reality, or is it a fixed reality, yet can be manipulated by them through these physical/spiritual means?
There's a hell of a question. Great question. I think, John, for my 2 cents worth, and then I'll let Scott jump in, but for my 2 cents worth, John, I think you put your finger right on it. For them, humanity is a malleable thing. It's something that they can mold and shape and twist and stretch into any shape that they want. And again, they're not really concerned ultimately with what it means to be human in the sense that you and I would use it. What they're aiming at is, as we said in the first segment, they're aiming at this total transformation of human consciousness, and they can remake that into anything that they want it to be as well. So yeah, definitely they view it as something malleable.
I would agree entirely with Joseph's comments on that. The idea of fusing man with whatever could be imagined is part of the agenda It really doesn't matter so long as the experiment moves forward and the end product, whether it is partial man, partial animal, partial technological, or biological, is of really no consequence. The end result is just what happens to come out of it.
Let me give you an example, John, of what we were talking about in that respect. When we were researching this book, we found an instance, there are some transhumanists that actually will use the word manimal, in other words, to refer to these fusions of mankind and animal. And we found an example. We were just both kind of dumbfounded when we encountered this. But there were some genetic engineers, I forget exactly where right off the top of my head, that had engineered a mouse to produce human cells, human sperm cells. So in other words, it raises the prospect that eventually they would be able to create a human being whose parents quite literally aren't human at all. They're mice. And that raises the question in law, then, what does it mean to be human? And, transhumanism is barreling down the tracks at us like a locomotive. And it's raising all of these philosophical questions and legal questions. And unfortunately, I think most people are unaware that these things are coming down the pike. And already, just since the book has been out, one of the things that Scott and I speculated on, John, was that by eating all of these genetically modified foods, there could be a possibility that would introduce genetic modifications in the people consuming it. Well, we've already found an article since then, I plan to blog about it on my website, that indicates that this is indeed happening. And already we're finding, some of these companies that are doing these genetic experiments, now the Supreme Court's going to hear a case on whether or not that type of being can be patented. So in other words, this is racing down the tracks at us in any number of directions, not just technologically, but culturally and in terms of our law.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what, let's drink from this cup for a moment. Now, you'd have to embrace the existence, the belief in the existence of UFOs and ETs and so forth. Is there anything in your research that suggests that ETs are a component in this? Are they assisting the humans?
Oh boy, in my own body of research, I wrote a book called Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men that you referred to at the beginning of the show.
Yes.
And if you look at some of those ancient texts that we discuss kind of in a roundabout way in the Transhumanism book, but in that other book more particularly, you do find the idea that mankind was somehow engineered into existence, that we are ourselves already chimerical creatures of a sort. Now, the interesting thing, the interesting biological problem that raises is that in order for that to occur, there has to be some sort of genetic resemblance to begin with. And, the transhumanists are really saying, with all of these fusions that Scott talked about, what they're really saying is that the line or the definition of human nature is very, very fuzzy and can bleed over into species that we wouldn't even recognize as human.
This is pretty scary stuff. Who seems to be
scary.
The Nazis were into this, were they not?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. The Nazis were trying to create, with their Lebensborn genetic programs and so on, they were trying to create a new kind of man. The Soviets were trying to create new Soviet man and engineer quite literally out of existence in humanity this idea of consciousness or spirituality. So you have all of these things at work in it.
Not to exclude what is taking place within our own country.
Oh, yeah.
With the mice experiments.
Yeah,
the Mayo
exactly.
Clinic with the sheep and the pigs with human blood. This is a worldwide phenomenon now.
Yeah. Yeah.
There are a lot of phenomena that seem to be occurring all at once, as if... I don't know if there's anything, this 2012 thing, I'm suspicious of all these sorts of declarations, but it doesn't escape my notice that according to statistics, and as we know, Mark Twain said, there are lies, damn lies, and statistics, but it appears that suicide is now at the top of the list as far as injury-induced causes of death.
Well, it's interesting, John, that you mention the 2012 thing, because one thing that we encountered in this whole transhumanist research that we were doing is the almost apocalyptic outlook that you have among some transhumanists. They all are future-oriented. They're all saying, in other words, that all of these technological gimmicks that we're now able to perform are bringing a new world into existence, and it's really the end game, so to speak. It's the final transformation of humanity for many of these people, and for many of them, they even talk about circumventing or going around or short-circuiting the process of evolution and taking the whole thing into our own hands. Well, once you've said that, then we get into three different scenarios in the book. The heaven scenario, that all of this is going to bring about some sort of glorious utopia, a golden age. And then you have the hell scenario, that this is going to so completely obliterate humanity as we know it that, it will be quite literally a living hell for humans of the normal variety. And then there's a kind of a middle-of-the-ground scenario that some people call the prevail scenario, that we're going to somehow muddle through this and reject some aspects of this. But any way you slice it, John, you're absolutely right. You're dealing with an apocalyptic viewpoint.
And one which has been repeated throughout, it seems, the story or the myth of human history. Civilizations that were very advanced and disappeared. Civilizations that rose again and disappeared. And with every advance seems to be an over-advance, which leads to either an intervention from a higher being that pushes humanity back down, divides it, splits it. This going back as far as Plato even, or like some of the earliest religious texts, whether one takes the Hindu text or takes the biblical text. The recurring theme of a civilization which has reached beyond what it should somehow strikes the anger or the threat of the divine being, which strikes it, splits it, divides it, conquers it, and puts it back into a place where either everything must begin again from anew, or be rebuilt from a very low level, recover the technologies of the past, recover the knowledge of the past, kind of a Ayn Rand anthem moment of reawakening to learning and reachieving what man is capable of, and every time it seems to go around and around.
I'm just wondering, what is mankind supposed to be capable of in the wildest extrapolation of these transhumanists' dreams?
Oh, boy. Again, I think it goes back to something that Ray Kurzweil mentioned in his book, John, and that is they're aiming to transform the universe in the image of man. That quite literally is what he's talking about when he says that these technologies are now making the idea of extending human consciousness and putting the human stamp on the entire universe. That's literally what they mean. So in other words, in a certain sense, they're violating that old dividing line between man and God. They literally are viewing themselves with godlike powers.
And therefore, it would follow that they would perhaps attempt to expand human consciousness beyond this mortal coil of a body. Right,
exactly. They talk, they talk about computer chips and downloading a person's entire memory. They talk about nanotechnology that would be capable of repairing the body as it goes. And I'll tell you, John, the most interesting thing, at least for me, in researching all of this, we go back to alchemy. Alchemy taught that the philosopher's stone, in some of its incarnations or manifestations, was a literal elixir of life. It was kind of a universal vaccine. Well, lo and behold, when you read the Transhumanism book, we refer to the fact that the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, is, in fact, investigating all sorts of pathogens in order to determine if they share anything in common, and if so, if that thing in common can be inoculated against. In other words, what they are searching for is quite literally the Philosopher's Stone. They're searching for that universal vaccine or elixir of life. So there you have it.
This is really fascinating stuff. All right, now let's beat up on the GMO thing for a minute. You know, you hear these people trying to talk about it. Bloomberg says, okay, we're not going to. They're getting $14.50 a pack for cigarettes in New York City. $14.50. I saw it myself, and in fact, I saw somebody buy some last week. He wanted to put a ban on 16-ounce drinks. Of course, it's okay, I guess, if you carry 2 8-ounce drinks, but whatever. We're being told by the White House, First Lady, that we must change our diets. Well, if this is in furtherance of improving human health, why do we not ban high fructose corn syrup, ban partially hydrogenated vegetable oil, ban margarine, ban aspartame, ban acetaminophen while you're at it? That's not really food. And why have these people gotten into this genetically modified organism? We were doing fine with natural seeds, but now they've produced this strain of seeds that really cause problems. They thin the gut on the animals when they're fed the GMOs and causing all sorts of health problems. And then I just heard that Bill Gates has invested in Monsanto. Mm-hmm. I mean, what is this?
Well, there's 2 tracks to this, I think, John. And the first is, the bottom line in the first instance is profits. The simple thing is that in patent law, in American patent law, a seed that is produced through normal agronomical practice that mankind has been pursuing for thousands of years is very different from genetically modified organisms or crops, because those have direct, sudden interventions of humanity, and therefore the product of that technology is patentable. So in other words, you're looking at quite literally billions, if not trillions of dollars in profits from the standpoint of changing all of human agriculture to GMO foods. These companies stand to make huge, enormous profits. But there is, I suspect, and we wrote about this in the book, there is, I suspect, a much deeper problem, and that is that if you look at alchemy, the Philosopher's Stone is said to be able to promote longevity and to give life. In other words, to transform mankind if it's ingested. And in fact, if you look at most religions, there is some notion of the food of the gods or sacred food or what have you. I mean, my word, even in Christianity, you have the Eucharist, for example, that is supposed to be a deifying meal, all right? So you are what you eat, in other words. That's why we had that quotation of Ludwig Feuerbach in the book. So we also suspect that there may be a much deeper esoteric goal here. By modifying the food, they are attempting to modify mankind. And I go back to something I mentioned earlier, and that is that when we were writing the book, we kind of speculated that, okay, if you can genetically modify this food, wouldn't that inevitably introduce some sort of evolutionary response or genetic modification in mankind himself? And already now we're finding the studies coming out that are beginning to suggest precisely that. So from our standpoint, it may be very deliberate that they're introducing this for yet another means or mechanism for the transformation of mankind.
Unbelievable.
It's affecting the transformation of mankind.
It is affecting the transformation of mankind.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, this is fascinating stuff. That has been a quick hour, and I'm delighted to report we have 2 more to go with our guests tonight, Doctors Joseph Farrell and Scott DeHart. This is fun in a scary kind of way. Hopefully it won't become too scary. Thank you very much for being with us tonight. We shall continue. This is Coast to Coast AM. You know, one of our guests on here with, along with Bill Jasper and Rosa Corey about Agenda 21 some weeks ago. I like to repeat this whenever possible because she really said, and I asked her, is this original? Did you just make that up? Or did you quote somebody? I said, no, I just said it. And it was, you can't control what you don't know you have. And I'm going to try this to tie this together with something that I just heard. I don't know if you heard it because there's not much telling what you hear in your particular locale. It could be anything from, well, it could be anything. I'm afraid if I were to quote some possible examples, it might border on tastelessness. But Darryl Strawberry, a baseball player, professional baseball player, and those guys make huge money too, was talking about how his mother became the centerpiece of his life and how his father beat him regularly, told him he wouldn't amount to anything. Please keep in mind that some of these professional athletes, not all, but many of them, would quite literally, with that sort of tutelage from a so-called parent, may he be forgiven, and may Darryl Strawberry get over it, or at least adapt to it if he can't get over it. You take somebody like that who might be otherwise totally unemployable and put him in a position to succeed like that and give them no support whatsoever. Just get out there and win. Come on, you can do it, babe. You're the one. The tragedies that have befallen the NFL's players, I believe that we should consider deeply, particularly those people in authority, to take steps to protect the people who make you your money. Don't let NFL go from National Football League to numbskulls for life. Would that be okay with you? We'll see. We'll be back with the good doctors in just a moment. This is Coast to Coast AM. Doctors Farrell and DeHart. Some years ago, I saw a report on one of the nature channels about fish. Whether or not the males were even necessary was really the subject of this, and I'm sure a number of women have wondered that. But the entire experiment resulted in, when the males were removed and the females became somewhat hermaphroditic, they began to develop physical maladies and weaknesses and deformities and so forth. So at the end of the presentation, it was just, the whole thing boiled down to, well, the males are in there just to keep things mixed up. So I'm wondering, what about androgyny and what would we call it, hermaphroditedom, as part of the alteration to the human being in the future?
Well, that's a large question, and we do take quite a stab at that in the book because of the ancient religious texts which deal with the question of an androgynous being to begin with, from what appears to be an androgynous creator. And then is it an anomaly that there are these examples throughout history, and sometimes revered by their cultures, and sometimes, in fact, seem to be monsters that have to be destroyed, which were hermaphroditic or androgynous. And the most recent studies, and those that really started coming to the forefront in the 19th century, particularly in Britain, began to arrive at the conclusion that hermaphroditism is a thing of degrees, that all persons, to a degree, because of the embryonic androgyny or hermaphroditism, to the present day, there is a unifying element that then divides. So it's not all that surprising to us, given the ancient stories, civilizations, religions, and views of the creator or divine being or initial first cause of things, that it then would result in a creation which begins in the same way and for some reason has fallen from that original state. So in transhumanism, is there a goal to reverse that and get back to such a being? And we found, surprisingly, that yes, not only is it philosophically of interest, but it's taking place in the laboratories. And one has to wonder if the ancient civilizations, religions, views of God saw this as an elevated human form, then why would it not surprise us that today they're trying to reverse engineer that, get back to it, and perhaps employ such a being for a higher purpose, if not move everybody at some point in that direction. That was a very frightening prospect to us.
So let me add one thing there, if I may, John, too. This is another example, we think, of the hidden alchemical agenda at work, because, as Scott said, they are trying to do these things in the laboratory. Well, it's interesting, when you read alchemical texts, one of the great works that they speak of is the ability to create a homunculus, in other words, a human being, without the aid of either a male or a female parent. In other words, you're literally creating a test tube baby, and this is what they're, again, trying to do. So, in addition to creating all of these fusions with mice and pigs with human blood and so on and so forth, they're also trying to create life, quite literally, in a flask, just as the alchemist did. So, in other words, again, we have yet another specific detail where something is referred to in ancient texts, and they're doing it today. And I'm in total agreement with Scott, too. I think it's because these things are viewed in some texts as a higher being, and they want to get back to that.
And as a higher being, they either may be very useful and could be employed in a much higher service or the starting of something such as a new race, or they could be seen as a great threat if not controlled. So it's not only of interest to Joseph and myself as those who've studied theology and philosophy and history, but also it's of great interest to people in science what this would really mean. And it is a frightening thing, because the bottom line is we're faced with the possibility of some very heavy legal questions as to what does it mean to be human. And it's not just animals. It is now the question as to these embryos that are being put in a dish and created and supposedly destroyed, though in some cases one wonders whether they have been. And is that even moral to do? Is it ethical to create a human sort of person, if not a human, and then destroy it and say it is not? At what point does it have rights to exist? And where do you divide the line as to what is human? This takes us back to some controversies that affected our own idea of who in various races in our own country could be considered human.
Right.
Well, I don't think Medvedev was joking when he sort of made it look like a joke when he realized his microphone was still on. But according to him, there are dossiers kept on actual extraterrestrials walking among us. So, okay, fine. That's fine. Let's just leave that aside for a second. We'll just set it on the table and get back to it in a second. The thing that I don't mean to just pursue this like doggedly, and if it's one of those deals where we don't want to go there, just say, let's go on to something else. I don't feel like, and I'll roll with you on it because this is just a discourse. But tell me something. I should know this already, but you achieved your doctorates in what specifically?
I have my doctorate in patristics, which is the study of the early church fathers.
Okay.
And mine was focused also on theological and legal questions
Excellent.
in the 19th century.
Excellent. Well, let me ask you this. In your opinion, just your opinion, because I know we don't know, what is consciousness? And that whole Ayn Rand thing, the axiomatic definition of consciousness, one of the listeners out there, a guy named Dan, is he's taking exception that I have allowed you to deny her axiomatic definition of consciousness, which is basically just there are some components of our existence that are not going to be analyzed.
Well, let's go back to something that we said in the first segment, John, about this metaphor that we were talking about, that can be taken in two ways, very different ways, theistically and atheistically. If you look at the same metaphor from the standpoint of consciousness, what you would discover in a lot of these ancient philosophers is that they don't really define it because they recognize that the individual human person ultimately is so absolutely unique and without analogy. The only analogy is to another human person that is unique, but that's as far as it can be pressed. So in other words, they don't even really attempt to define it. What they would say would be something to the effect that consciousness is the sum total of all of our thoughts, feelings, memories, emotions, and so on, and more. In other words, they would make a distinction between the person and the soul. But ultimately, they would say it's nothing because it's, again, without analogy. And that's why in these ancient views you find mankind linked so directly with the gods or with God because, again, that's how they referred to God.
Well, all right then, and according to what I'm reading, an axiomatic concept is the identification of a primary fact of reality which cannot be analyzed.
Right.
So it sounds to me like these ancients held this same view.
Yeah, in essence they did. This is what you come away with very clearly when you start reading the early church fathers in particular, because they do not define what the human person is or what consciousness is, but they kind of give you examples of how it functions or what the signatures are that you look for, but they never mistake the signatures for the thing itself. In other words, they're viewing things in much the same way that they view creation. They're viewing creation as a signature of God, or nothing for that matter, but never the same thing as nothing.
Well, I like Dan's questions because, look, it's okay with me if somebody holds fast and hard to their opinions, because that's the only way that you can, once those opinions are challenged, then you really have to analyze your opinion closely. And, you know, if you're open-minded, you'll abandon it if you're found to be wrong, and you'll further your research to absolutely present a conclusion that your opinion is grounded in some sort of fact or certainly some rational thought.
Well, consciousness also begins with a certain set of presuppositions, doesn't it?
Well, yeah. And if you're unconscious, there is no reality. Well, I mean, it just stands to reason.
Yeah, we have, the other thing that we need to note is what we're trying to do in this book is raise the question about all of these things in conjunction with law. Well, it's interesting that our system of law does recognize the difference between consciousness and unconsciousness and does not define the person as the content of consciousness. It's still murder if you go and bludgeon someone with a baseball bat in a hospital bed that's in a coma. They may not be conscious as we know it, but it's still considered murder in our jurisprudence. So they have this recognition, albeit it's something that's never spelled out or defined. But when you look back at this metaphor, the other thing that we need to remember here is because they're looking at consciousness axiomatically, they're also looking at the physical medium itself in the same way. This is why you find so many versions of ancient texts that talk of the universe, the physical universe itself, as having some form of consciousness. So again, you have kind of this bleed over, so to speak, between God and then the physical medium from which everything is created, and then consciousness itself. They're all viewed in more or less the same way.
Well, and comparing even within the same religion, one might take a more Catholic view, one might take a more Protestant view and talk about consciousness in terms of one's identity and knowledge of oneself in relationship to God for one to be truly conscious, or one might take a Hindu perspective and raise the question that, in fact, all of this is a bit of a play, of a flickering image flashing across our memories, and that is our sense of reality. It really is filled with so many presuppositions that this is, I think, one reason why the focus of the book was not so much on answering that level of a question from a position of René Descartes or somebody else, but rather addressing the question from where we stand in relationship to history, ancient texts, and modern science, as in relationship to what was coming out of alchemy in the Middle Ages, and trying to make some connections and bridging it forwards and backwards, specific to the subject of the transhumanistic movement.
All right, then. Now, when someone suggests to you that if they're open enough to suggest to you that their religious beliefs are being challenged by these scientific advances, how do you respond?
Well, Joseph, do you want to take that, since we actually wrestled quite a bit in the book over trying to avoid really setting forward any judgment on the religious positions of anybody reading it, but more or less to expose it. Joseph, do you want to pick up on that? Or?
Well, yeah. Basically, John, our approach is just what Scott said. Our approach is primarily dealing with ancient texts and the resemblance between transhumanism and alchemy. But in the book, we do not get into deep theological matters or pronouncements or judgments one way or the other about any of these types of issues. Certainly, we do think that transhumanism poses some very, very difficult questions for a whole variety of religious systems, not just the Christian. But we leave it up for the individual reader to come to their own conclusions based on their own faith or lack thereof, for that matter, on what the movement actually spells and what it portends for human culture. But we really don't get into any judgments about the theological systems that might be threatened or enhanced by it.
So alchemy is a real thing, then? Sorry, I cut somebody off.
No problem.
No, we think alchemy is real in the sense that what you see in alchemy in terms of the phases of the evolution of mankind, from androgyny to the mineral man to vegetable man to animal man.
Yeah.
When we look at transhumanism, it's tinkering with humanity and fusing the human being with all sorts of animal creation, even with plant creation, mineral creation. You have transhumanists talking about enhancing human memory by direct computer chip interface and implants in the brain and so on and so forth. So in other words, they're talking essentially about alchemy. They're just dressing it up in modern technique and technology.
Okay, so this is not something that's coming down the road. It's happening now.
It's happening now. Absolutely. It's happening now. And really, even in the years since we wrote the book and it coming out this year, there have been confirmations and breathtaking extensions of this idea. They're now growing human brain neurons on computer chips and so on and so forth. They're downloading and uploading the memory of mice into computers that have learned how to run through a maze, and then implanting that computer chip in a mouse that hasn't run that maze, and it can immediately run the maze. They're doing all of these things, John, and this is what we mean by the alchemical transformation of man, because that's their goal. That's what they're up to.
Well, let me ask you this then. How does the possibility of some of these supercomputers, this big one whose name escapes me at this moment, I'll look into it in a minute.
Titan?
Yes, achieving singularity.
Oh, boy.
What happens then? I mean, if they're uploading mouse brains into computer, I mean, good Lord. I mean, yeah. This could become, didn't you mention hell on earth for human beings a little while ago?
Exactly. There's an interesting science fiction novel by Robert Heinlein called "The Moon is a Harsh Mistress," John.
I've read it, yep.
Yeah, in which that whole scenario is played out of a computer waking up because it's got so many information processing nodes that it actually assumes consciousness. And this is something that Scott and I talked about. We didn't get into it much in the book, but it is possible to entertain the idea that it might wake up and invoke some sort of consciousness from the ether.
That's all we need is a direct interface into that damn thing. I'll tell you what, we're going to take a little break, and as Joker said to the Batman, "You're just too much fun." I'm enjoying this thoroughly, and apparently, according to these emails, the audience is too. There's some strong opinions here. We'll take some calls later also, and just carry on. The day after Pearl Harbor, and now the day after the loss of John Lennon 32 years ago on December the 8th, 1980. We'll be back. This is Coast. Wouldn't it be nice to be just simple humans, stepping on squishy stuff in the yard that was unexpected, but getting over it in a few seconds and going on with the whole natural experience? Well, the human experience is becoming ever increasingly more unnatural. As I mentioned earlier, even with our little phones, everything that we do is incidental to communicating on this. these computers and things were supposed to help us accomplish ever so much more. Wonder what we can accomplish if we're permanently linked to one that has achieved singularity as transhumanism overtakes us and we're part snake, part wolf dog, part sheep. Let's hope not. We'll be back with the good doctors in just a moment. This is Coast to Coast AM. Doctors Farrell and DeHart, Frankenstein comes up every once in a while in your book and in this discussion. What's all this about Percy Shelley? I thought Frankenstein was written by Mary Shelley. Who's Percy?
Well, that's the commonly accepted literary position on it. However, it is one that at least we challenge the authorship on for a number of reasons. Not the least of which is that the first edition came out anonymously, which has no obvious authorship attributed to it. But beyond that, it leads to some rather interesting questions, considering not only the anonymous authorship, which was a pattern of Percy Shelley. He preferred to write either anonymously or using pseudonyms or attributing the work to somebody else who was living, passing off his own hidden agendas to somebody else because his agenda was rather controversial, if not illegal.
Really?
So that raised some questions to begin with. Then a closer investigation into the original preface of the 1818 anonymous version in comparison with what later became, after his death, the next, and today perhaps the most standard edition, the 1831 edition. Mary then writes a preface, which is in fact not only different from the first one, but admits one of the great things that is often overlooked, which is he wrote the first preface, which was in the anonymous edition. And in the first preface, the person who wrote it, which we now know is Percy, recalls the process of the story quite differently than Mary did, with some actual facts, considering who was there at that event when it was being discussed, where the story originated, and more specifically, that the book was written more as an interaction with the science of the day, whereas in 1831, Mary approaches it after his death as something of a ghost story, a waking dream. Because of all the inconsistencies that are raised simply in the preface itself, one has to ask, why would a single author, if there was one, and if it were Mary, confuse her own facts about how the story came about, the history behind the story, the people present during the idea and writing of the story, and then make some subtle changes, or perhaps not so subtle, changes into the text. But the overwhelming evidence of the story itself comes from the background of somebody deeply involved in science. This is clearly an indication of Percy's background, not hers, considering who he studied with at Sion House and later at Eton, his interest in studying very important alchemists such as Paracelsus, Agrippa, Albertus Magnus, men who were actively involved in the idea of the homunculus, of creating these without women or God sort of beings. Added to that, the hidden agenda of atheism, the obvious anonymity, which was his own pattern. Added to that, the setting of the story in Ingolstadt, the home of the Illuminati, which was a deeply important idea to Percy Shelley, as he even carried the writings of Adam Weishaupt, the founder of the Bavarian Illuminati, with him wherever he went. So when you begin to accumulate the evidence of the science, the anonymity, the preface problems, the Illuminati, the atheism, it begins to read exactly like a fictional autobiography of Percy's own life. And even the most honest scholars will admit that if Mary had written it, and most, of course, assume she did, that she must have relied heavily on his background of science, to have written such a book. However, she herself says, I didn't owe any suggestion or feeling to my husband in the writing of this, which is either a complete, absolute lie, or her part in doing what he always had done before that, write very controversial material, hide his agenda within it in such a beautiful, covert way that most people, unless they were, as he calls it, in the know, because he was very Gnostic-oriented, that she was participating in his very hope to spread the agenda, pass it off as anonymous. The early reviews said, this is Percy's work, and he quickly at that point said, no, this was not me, this is Mary, and he passed it off to her as he did so often when he tried to write things. So there's a huge amount of evidence to at least raise the question, though we don't attempt to in any way demean the person or the writing or the contribution of Mary. It's not meant to really take aim at her as being somebody who took credit for something she didn't write, but rather was complicit in a conspiracy that he was commonly accustomed to do.
Well, just to recapitulate then, what was his agenda?
Very good question. His agenda was very much aligned to that of Adam Weishaupt, which was to overthrow governments, and he wrote against the king, to overthrow the establishment of religion, which he saw as also oppressive and tearing down those boundaries that separated the people who wanted a life of free thought. That was part of his agenda, was that kind of atheistic worldview. Secondly, to do it by means of a social revolution without violence, because he was not a promoter of violence. On top of that, there was also a sense that what he wanted to do was to rewire how people saw humanity and to work more towards an accepting liberal point of view rather than one which was very exclusive and pushed out, as he was himself, from the University of Oxford for holding the position of being an atheist.
This is a strange crew. What I'm seeing is it true Mary Shelley, when she died in 1851, her husband's heart was found amongst her belongings?
This is, yes, one of the common ideas that is passed along.
Okay. Tell you what, curiouser and curiouser.
It is a very curious story. It's one that we questioned whether we should include in the book, but because of the very idea of an alchemist, and this is very much what Percy Shelley was involved with and had studied deeply and even experimented with electricity on his sisters and cats and dogs.
Oh.
To take somebody who was this interested in the studies of Paracelsus, Agrippa, Albertus Magnus, and then bring these to the forefront, and then hide it within a novel, we felt we had to at least bring it forward because in the 19th century, there was so much of this agenda moving forward with the questions of what does it mean to be human? What about hermaphrodites? What about the question of religion and state? This was such a revolutionary time period of considering all of these questions of authority that it fed very nicely into the idea of the book, which was to not just examine one thing in transhumanism, a grimoire, but rather to examine several different facets of it, ancient religious texts, ancient philosophy, science, alchemy, literature, and where is this all going, and is there a bridge connecting all of it? And so we tried to write it in such a way that for the average person who's thinking, what do all of the religions have in common? What do they think of God? Or if there is a God, how does mankind come into being, achieve some level of maturity in society? How does it fall? And why is there a connection with these things? And why is transhumanism attempting in some ways to reverse engineer the process and to get man back to a more pristine or higher state? it is a book that we tried to cover quite a bit, and at the same time make very simple connections, so the average person who would be reading this would not have to be a scholar, but could perhaps find a few answers, breadcrumbs along the trail of human history and religion and science.
Well, as long as I'm just stirring this pot and just adding random spices to it, is there anything in your research that would suggest that there might be, it's like, we're not trying to create monsters at all. Actually, we're trying to, you just said something that sparked this thought. I mean, is there even a snowball's chance in Hades that there might be an agenda to actually improve the human being, or is this strictly all of the connotations so far are somewhat sinister? I mean, is there any possibility that something good might come out of this? Crickets.
Well, I was wondering if Joseph was going to jump in on that one, and apparently not. Well, I think that if you were to ask some of the people that are at work on it, I think the answer would be yes, of course we're trying to improve the quality of human life. That is the purpose, to try to create or to improve the health, the longevity, the awareness of people is a positive thing. Why would one want to argue with the fact that as science moves forward, man has to adapt to the future that he's brought into? So I think most of them would answer in the affirmative, yes, this is a positive thing. The question for us is, are these advances, in fact, perhaps leading to an elimination of what it means to be human and creating more of a hybrid type of human, which we feel there's a great loss in if pushed beyond the limits, and raising the question as to, is there an agenda behind it which could lead to us ceasing to be the people, the humans that we are? That for us is a very important point to at least contemplate, rather than just say this is all a utopian future.
Let's take an example, John, of something that we struggled with in this book. The transhumanists speak of a coming almost virtual immortality, all right? And most of us, if our first gut reaction would be, well, that's a good thing. And it could be. If we can imagine, say, a Mother Teresa or an Albert Schweitzer having thousands of years to do their work, that would be a good thing. Or if we can imagine lifespans that would allow people to not only learn just one thing, but several things, to have many different careers. You know, we can imagine our famous scientists who are famous for basically one discovery might come up with several. So on the one hand, you have that heaven scenario in transhumanism that there is a potential here for a great deal of good. But by the same token, there's a hell scenario, because we can also imagine people like a Joseph Stalin or an Adolf Hitler having thousands of years to do what they did. Or we can even imagine a case that so many people have pointed out, that human progress and knowledge seems to be somehow linked very definitely to our mortality. And there are some people who look at this coming virtual immortality somewhat aghast, because what they see it might lead to is a stagnation rather than an improvement. So the bottom line is, even the transhumanists themselves don't really know what sort of future they're bringing about. They just know they're bringing about a very, very different future for humanity. And it could go
that's great. So we don't know how big the explosion is. Let's go ahead and let it off anyway and see.
Exactly.
I'll tell you what. I don't know. It worked with the A-bomb, but I'm wondering how many more times are we going to get lucky with this? You know, as long as we're talking about...
That's another show.
You know, as long as we're talking about these wonderful authors, what about Oscar Wilde's Picture of Dorian Gray? Now, there's some obtuse thinking.
Well, the same questions arose for Joseph and I when it came to the background of Oscar Wilde and the Picture of Dorian Gray, simply because, again, we were dealing with not just a book, but with a man who was very interested in philosophy, as well as one who didn't mind whatsoever sliding in some very alchemical themes to the story, the ideas of spiritualizing man and creating a higher society. That Dorian Gray was the consummation for which the whole human history was moving towards, that he, in fact, was perhaps reliving through himself the lives and lives of generations before him, moving towards the highest perfect human form, which, curiously, is also, to borrow the ideas of Giordano Bruno, who is quoted, or mentioned, I should say, in the story. And Bruno, among other things, was condemned for proclaiming ideas of not only multiple worlds or universes, but multiple lives that the soul is moving back through and moving towards at a higher level. It is, we think, not even remotely accidental that somebody such as Oscar Wilde would pull in through this story the ideas of somebody who's using his words, Lord Henry in the story, somebody who is discussing the process of gemstones and altars and specific types of scents, incense or smells, and also using the idea of memory to bring about this transformation that is taking place in Dorian. It reads precisely like an alchemist's process for changing a person and changing society, which specifically does come out in the person of Dorian Gray. And this was not something that is accidental and slid into the story, but rather something that Oscar in his own life seemed to have his own personal interest in. And we look at the book and even his own commentaries when the book was being first published, where he almost gives a commentary about it in his work, The Critic as Artist, and says, I'm too conscious of the fact that we're born in an age when only the dull are treated seriously, but he says he lives in terror of not being misunderstood. And part of that sense of not being misunderstood deals with his views of aesthetics, of catharsis, of change, and moving towards a higher, more beautiful, and in some sort of fashion with Plato, a unity among all people and within humanity, which is accidentally being achieved through this empty soul, an empty object where a conjugation or incantations take place and a transfiguration happens. And this within the context of gemstones and altars and vestments and incense. It was all a bit too much to ignore when dealing with 19th century issues and people who were writing very alchemically oriented novels.
You know, I'm thinking, going back to what you said earlier, if mouse brains can be uploaded, then theoretically memory could be downloaded into a new cloned body.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking perhaps that way madness lies. I mean, how much experience and memory can the human being really handle? Let's take our break and come back with the good doctors. I'm enjoying this just, well, a lot, and certainly hope that you are too. Joseph Farrell and Scott DeHart on Coast to Coast AM.